Today's video is sponsored by Saley, of whom more in a little bit. Having recently done a video in Wapping, the place, it feels like I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the station serving it, because it's quite an interesting one. You see the shape of the station building? Well, it's like that for a very curious historical reason. You see, Wapping Station did not start out as a station. There's a bit of a long story behind this. We need to go all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century. The Port of London was booming. The River Thames was a great highway for cargo from all over the world. New docks larger than ever before were being planned and constructed. Yet ironically, while you could get all over the world from here, it was impossible to get from East London to South East London. The ships, the very thing that brought prosperity to the docks, also created a great moving barrier. The bridge furthest east was London Bridge, which was in the centre of town, always congested and quite a hike from the East End. But building a bridge actually in the Docklands was impossible, because it would have to be impractically tall to clear the masts of ships. The obvious solution was build a tunnel. But, well, it's easy to say build a tunnel, much harder to actually do it. The riverbed was muddy, silty, and very polluted, far too sloppy to hold a tunnel. The problem had defeated some of the greatest engineering minds of the time. Ralph Dodd had had a shaft sunk, but it kept flooding beyond the ability of contemporary steam power to pump it out. Maybe that's why he looks so annoyed here. Even Richard Trevithick, inventor of the steam train and a man with extensive experience of building mining tunnels under the sea, had to throw his hands up and admit defeat. But there was a man who had an idea that would change the whole course of engineering. His name was Brunel. No, not that Brunel, his dad. Mark Isambard Brunel was a Frenchman who had fled the Revolution and settled in Britain. France's loss was very much Britain's gain, because he went on to work for the Royal Navy inventing machinery for mass production of pulley blocks. Which doesn't sound very exciting, but was incredibly important to the war effort. However, he's probably most famous for an invention he patented in 1818. While working for the Navy, he became interested in the shipworm. This has a head protected by a pair of shells that dig into the wood of a ship's hull. Brunel wondered if one could build something similar on a larger scale, and so he came up with the tunnelling shield. The shield could be driven forward into the soil using screws. Then a bunch of chaps with spades would clear the soil inside the shield out, and another bunch of chaps would reinforce the tunnel behind them. Then the shield would be driven forward some more. It's a simple idea, but it would revolutionise tunnelling. The same basic concept is still in use today, albeit much more sophisticated. It took decades to get from Rotherhithe to Wapping under the Thames, but fortunately travel is a lot quicker these days. So quick, in fact, that it's easy to forget the little things, and that's why I'm glad that today's video is sponsored by Saley. See, if you're travelling, you'll want to stay connected. There's nothing worse than racking up roaming charges or relying on public Wi-Fi when you need to get online. Well, I don't know, I suppose being buried alive is worse, but those other things are also pretty annoying. That's where Saley comes in. Saley uses your phone's eSIM function to get you all the data you need at an extremely decent price. It works on any phone that has an eSIM function, so you're good whether you're on iOS or Android. What you do is you download the app, select your data plan, and Saley will connect once you reach your destination. There are over 200 destinations served, and multiple data plans to suit you, including regional or global plans if you're a true jet setter. Even better, viewers of this channel can get 15% off their data plans. Just enter the code JAGO at checkout, or use the link in the description below, or this QR code. If only digging a tunnel under the Thames was as quick, easy and affordable as Saley. But it wasn't. So there. Unfortunately, before Brunel could find a use for his wonderful new device, he was thrown in debtor's prison. The Admiralty had been slow about paying him for his inventions. In fact, Brunel was very seriously considering moving to Russia, since it looked like the Tsar might show a bit more gratitude than the king. No less a figure than the Duke of Wellington intervened to demand that the government clear Brunel's debt, lest the nation lose one of its greatest minds. Well, adopted greatest minds. Now he was a free man, Brunel decided that the Thames Tunnel would be the ultimate test for his shield, and he began devising a plan. His tunnel would run from Rotherhithe to Wapping, with ramps at either end to allow both road and pedestrian traffic. Wellington once again came through and was one of the investors in Brunel's Thames Tunnel Company. The scheme received royal assent in 1824, and in 1825 the first working shaft was sunk at Rotherhithe. Well, as I say, it's easy to talk about building a tunnel. The dig was slow and dangerous. Sickness was rife among the workforce, arising from the pollution around them. Brunel's 20-year-old son, Isambard Kingdom, was brought in to supervise construction after the original supervisor fell ill. The tunnel flooded twice, the second time nearly killing young Isambard and bringing work to a halt. Construction resumed in 1836. The tunnel had become a national joke, and I'd love to say that when it was completed, Brunel left the doubters with egg on their faces, but, well, he didn't quite. The tunnel was finally completed and opened to the public in 1843, but only as a pedestrian subway. The company couldn't afford to build the vehicle ramps. It was a great novelty when it first opened, with millions of visitors paying a penny to cross via this wonder of the age. Performers and traders set up shop there. So did petty criminals of various descriptions. But without vehicle traffic it had no long-term future. Well, not as a pedestrian tunnel. See, in the time between a tunnel being proposed and the tunnel becoming unfashionable, a network of railways had sprung up all over London. 6 of the railway companies saw an opportunity. The tunnel was the perfect size to run trains through. The companies involved were the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, the Metropolitan Railway, the Metropolitan District Railway, the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, the South Eastern Railway and the Great Eastern Railway. They must have been pretty certain of their investment, because the South Eastern, the London, Chatham and Dover, and the London, Brighton and South Coast were rivals, and so too were the Metropolitan and the Metropolitan District. Nevertheless, they formed a new company called the East London Railway and bought the tunnel out in 1865 for £200,000, a fraction of what it had cost to build. The tunnel would require extension to enable trains to get into it. It was opened in sections. The first went from Wapping to what's now New Cross Gate. In 1871 a spur was opened to the now closed Old Kent Road station. In 1876 the line was extended north to Shoreditch with a connection to Liverpool Street. In 1880 another spur was built to New Cross, and then in 1884 a final spur opened to Whitechapel, where the line could connect with the Metropolitan and Metropolitan District lines. Wapping was one of the first stations to open. Much of the work to build it had already been done. In fact, it reused the workshaft from the building of the Thames Tunnel. While Brunel's shield was ingenious, the sinking of the workshafts couldn't have been simpler. They just built a brick cylinder and let it sink into the mud. The other shaft at Rotherhithe is now part of the Brunel Museum. Building the actual station was a complicated process. The company didn't want to spend more money than they had to. The tunnel was widened a little to provide platforms, and a ventilation shaft was sunk above the northern end of the platforms. Retaining walls were built, held up by counterforts and these metal struts you can see crossing the ventilation shaft. The builders were, however, able to recycle the original 1843 spiral staircase. The station looked very different back then, similar to the abandoned station at Shoreditch, although presumably with less graffiti. It was named Wapping and Shadwell. After all, there was no Shadwell station at that point. It would be renamed when the actual Shadwell opened in 1876. The stations along the East London Railway were not especially large or fancy because, frankly, the main purpose of the line was to provide a freight artery. The Metropolitan and the Metropolitan District would both provide some services from 1884 onwards. But the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway would provide the lion's share of passenger trains using a series of small tank engines. The A1 class were quickly nicknamed the Terriers because they were largely designed with the East London line in mind, and therefore, like Terriers, they were in the habit of diving down a hole. In fact, we can take the metaphor further because one of the most notorious features of Wapping Station was that it was infested with rats. It's the closest station to the river, and not only did passengers have to contend with rats running brazenly around the platform, but the damp and the smell of the river mud. The platforms were very narrow, and indeed they still are. All things considered, Wapping was the sort of station that you didn't visit unless you really had to. Still, it would receive a number of rebuilds over the years. In 1913, the East London line was electrified and all passenger services were taken over by the Metropolitan Railway, which made the East London line a de facto underground line, officially part of the Metropolitan line but operated as a separate entity. Big changes came to Wapping with the installation of a hydraulic lift in 1915, which in turn entailed demolishing the old building and replacing it with a wooden booking hall. In 1940, the Luftwaffe decided to have a go at remodelling themselves, and the station was destroyed by firebombing. The booking hall was temporarily replaced by a wooden hut, which would itself be replaced with something more permanent in the 50s. The fact of the matter was that as a tube line, the East London line was of fairly limited use. It ran from Shoreditch to New Cross and New Cross Gate, never entering central London. Passenger trains didn't even use the connection to Liverpool Street except under very exceptional circumstances. That connection would be pulled up in 1966. The main passenger traffic over the line came from dockers, which was fine as long as the docks lasted. But in the 1960s, shipping began to move downriver. The docks began to close down, and as they did, so the East London line lost its purpose. There was less and less freight and fewer passengers. There were a few proposals in the 1980s to improve things. One was to relay the Liverpool Street connection. That was vetoed by British Rail, who were planning to rebuild that terminus. Another was to extend the Jubilee line into the Docklands, which would have included an interchange at Wapping. That didn't happen either. The extension took a different route east. A third idea was to convert the whole line to light rail, which was a very fashionable concept in the 80s. Despite all this attention, Wapping Station was in a deplorable condition. The walls were grimy and damp. It was also so leaky that it had to be constantly pumped out. Drivers on the line were issued air fresheners to combat the stink. Still, there was hope. The Greater London Council believed that upgrading the East London line could go some way to bettering the lot of the people of East London. Renovations would take place at Wapping in 1982. The musty old brickwork would be covered by panelling, and the ticket hall would be rebuilt yet again. In 1990, the East London line officially became a separate line on the tube map, which only really served to highlight how disconnected it was from everything else. The Jubilee line re-enters the picture in 1995. The interchange would be at a new station called Canada Water, and so the East London line was closed to allow the station to be built. London Transport also took the opportunity to patch the Thames Tunnel up. Initially, the plan was to simply concrete over the Victorian features, but a last-minute intervention got them listed. Instead, by way of a compromise, shotcreting was used, a thin layer of concrete over the original features, preserving the basic structure. Wapping Station was itself spruced up. Vitreous panelling depicting the history of the station and the area was installed. They never fully sorted out the problem of water ingress, though. Even more change was on the way. The East London Line extension was a concept that had come about in the 1980s. Now this was exactly what it sounds like, extending the line at both ends onto existing suburban railways to provide better connections. It would eventually come to fruition as the London Overground. The line would be extended south onto the South London Line and north onto an abandoned section of the old North London Railway. But old Wapping looked like it wasn't going to be invited to the party. The platforms were too short and too narrow. They were neither safe nor practical per the regulations governing rail safety. Eventually an exception to the rules was granted in 2004. Wapping would be included in the Overground, but you'd just have to watch your step. The East London line of the Underground closed in 2007 and reopened in 2010 as part of the London Overground. As of last year, it sits on the Windrush line. When I talked about the oldest sections of the Underground a couple of weeks back, a few people expressed sorrow that I hadn't included the East London line, on the grounds that it's no longer a part of the Underground. And that's understandable. Wapping isn't a tube station, but it deserves to be recognised as one of the oldest structures ever built on the Transport for London network, even if it's absolutely not doing what it was intended to do back in the 1820s. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I'd like it very much if you'd give this video a like, and perhaps subscribe for more if you're so inclined. Main sources today were The Impact of the Railways in the East End 1835 to 2010 by Emma Dwyer, East London Line by Vic Mitchell and Keith Smith, and The Railways of London Docklands by Jonathan Willis. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the vitreous panelling to my dirty wall. I'd also like to thank Saley for sponsoring today's video. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.